We will get started. All right, so as always, feel free to leave questions and chats throughout the presentation, and I might kind of get to some depending on how they come up, but definitely there'll be time at the end for questions, so definitely, but feel free to leave it in the chat as we're going throughout. So today's topic is all about the psychology of eating and how to improve your relationship with food. So before we get started, I always like to start off with kind of a self-reflection and just thinking of how do you currently view food? So maybe what 3 words come to mind when you think of your current relationship with food? Do you feel like it's fun, exciting, flavorful? Is it frustrating, time consuming? Like what kind of comes up? And just thinking about how much of your time and energy is around food or weight or body image. And what, if anything, would you like to be different in terms of your relationship with food? So today we're going to talk about why things like diets and really restricting our food intake does not really work long term. And then we'll also touch on things like our complex relationship between how we eat and also our feelings and thoughts around food and how that can influence our eating behaviors. And then how to really work on bringing awareness, attunement, and reconnecting with our body's cues to meet our physical and emotional needs. And then lastly, working towards maybe making peace with food if that is something that you would like to improve upon. So I think in order to talk about how we can enhance our relationship with food, we also need to kind of take a step back to think about what our society's relationship with food is like. And if any of you have, been on the internet or social media, we see all these headlines all of the time. And we hear really contradicting statements. We hear foods are good and bad. And I think we kind of tend to get the message that over time, we really can't trust our bodies, that we have to micromanage what we eat. We have to be really rigid with how we eat. And this typically leads to a lot of guilt and shame when we inevitably eat that cupcake or cookie or don't have that salad. And so we just have a very kind of tumultuous relationship with food, just with all the messaging and whatnot that we're getting within our society. And then we also have so many factors that influence our eating behaviors. So one is, kind of going off of, again, our kind of societal view, we have all of these media headlines that really tend to take what's actually coming from the scientific literature, a lot of times out of context. There's a lot of generalizations that are made and things that really aren't fully backed up in the literature. So we also get a lot of misinformation, a lot of disinformation out there. And nowadays, with the rise of social media and bloggers, there's a lot of individuals that are touting nutrition advice or touting nutrition, I would say, quote unquote, facts, when the reality is they might not be vested in evidence-based nutrition. We also live in a very kind of diet culture world, right, where we're very focused on weight and dieting and how to lose weight. And so that can also be a lot of what's impacting our eating behaviors. And then habits, right? Think about how many of your eating habits are just very subconscious. For a lot of us, we might find that, once we turn on Netflix in the evening, we're finding something sweet. Or once we get home from running errands, we're like grabbing something in the cupboard. So a lot of our eating patterns are just a very subconscious habit that's been formed over time that we're not even really cognizant of. And so we have to do a lot of work to notice, what's habit and how is this really serving us? Is this really helping us? And then not to mention when we actually sit down to eat or are deciding what to eat and how much to eat, there's so many factors that affect that. From food preferences, how stressed or distracted we are, how much energy or time we might have, our culinary skills, what food's available. So all of these factors are constantly affecting what we're eating and how much we're eating. And really, I find for a lot of individuals, the knowledge is there. And really, when we talk about wanting to change our eating behaviors, we really have to look at the underlying causes. So what's contributing to that to always grabbing a croissant in the morning when you swing by the coffee shop. Okay, well, we have to like look at that habit and how can we change that? And so this is really where awareness and attunement has to come in order to be aware of the habits and then how we inevitably change them. So, kind of to touch back on what I was talking about earlier and things like diets and restricting our eating patterns really tend to not work long term. I want everyone to take a moment and think if there was a time that you restricted your food choices. So maybe you were monitoring calories in MyFitnessPal. Maybe you said you were going to get rid of carbs or desserts. And how did that feel? Did that actually accomplish your goal of not eating that food? How long were you able to do that for? Most people I find are only able to sustain this for a short period of time, and then they end up over consuming those foods, feeling really tired. So there's typically a lot of repercussions. So we see from the research that when we start to go on a diet, and when I say diet, I mean like restricting calories, restricting food groups, even just telling yourself, like, I'm not going to eat dessert. All of these can really backfire. And so, one is we actually see increased thoughts around food, and the reward center of our brain gets more activated. So, we tend to think about food more. And then, when we are eating it, that reward center tends to get even more heightened. We also have increased levels of ghrelin, which is that hunger hormone, and decreased levels of leptin. So we're already restricting what we're eating, and we are hungrier and having a more difficult time getting full. There's also increased cravings for food, and then what's been termed by researchers as the what the hell effect. And if anyone's ever dieted before, I'm sure you can relate to this, where they had individuals come that had been restricting food, and they kind of gave them I believe, milkshakes and cookies. And so the individuals that had restricted their food intake, when they had a sip of a milkshake, ended up eating more of the milkshake and the cookies versus the individuals that were not restricting their food intake. So this is often seen when we say, oh, I ate one cookie, so I might as well eat all of the cookies, right? So we kind of find that we're overeating foods the moment we feel like we've broken a rule. And then there's also what's known as the Last Supper mentality. And this is where even when we're anticipating a deprivation, so we're anticipating we're going to start a diet Monday morning, what are we doing Sunday night? We're eating all of the foods that we're anticipating we won't get to eat. So what we really see happens is kind of this oscillation between that restriction or dieting that inevitably leads to overeating or binge eating or even just eating out of rebellion. Like, I don't want to follow these rules, so I'm going to go eat what I can't eat. And then what happens? We tend to feel guilty, we feel ashamed, and our solution is to go back onto a diet, which sets us up to swing back and forth. So we kind of get caught in this pendulum. And so I get a lot of clients and individuals that are wanting to stop the overeating or binge eating, and they're really focused on wanting to change that behavior. So in order to change that, we actually have to not even start that restriction or dieting in the first place, which is really hard for a lot of individuals when we're taught that that is what's going to produce, health outcomes. So it can be really challenging to kind of get through that. So kind of went over why dieting doesn't really work, why it's not really sustainable, but we also see effects long-term from dieting. So one, we know that these just aren't sustainable. When researchers have followed individuals for 1, 3, 5 years, people are not able to sustain these restrictive eating patterns. And they actually see that most individuals don't have long-term weight loss and they don't have any health benefits. So really isn't doing what we're taught to believe this is going to do. And in fact, most dieters regain weight or actually gain even more weight over time. And this is really seen with a lot of individuals that are kind of chronic dieters, weight cycling over time. And your body will start to compensate for the dieting by lowering your energy expenditure, so slowing down your metabolism. And we can see this also can affect people for years and years, especially if there is that chronic dieting mentality or behavior going on. And then, as I mentioned earlier, that restriction typically leads to that overeating and binge eating. And so we find that dieting is a huge predictor of eating disorders just because it fuels a lot of disordered eating behaviors. Not to mention, it adds a lot more stress. We're spending all this time and energy tracking our food and measuring our food and trying to figure out what to eat, which can just add a lot of stress, both physically on our bodies, especially if we're not getting adequate like nutrition and calories and nutrients in, but also just taking a toll on our emotional health and well-being. And we also see this with individuals having increased feelings of failure, worsening self-esteem, social anxiety, depression, and worsening body esteem. So over time, this really affects individuals physically and emotionally and mentally to the point where it can really kind of lead to this cycle of not taking care of ourselves and not really focusing on healthy habits. So if that doesn't really get us the outcomes that maybe we're hoping it will or we think it will, what can we do instead? So what we'll kind of focus on today is how to relearn to build your body's trust and awareness. So bringing back this attunement of your body to meet your own needs of how hungry am I and how full am I, rather than focusing on what something's telling you of how much to eat or when to eat. And then also taking into account thoughts and beliefs around food, learning how to nourish and cope without food, and bringing curiosity, like I said, to overall food patterns and habits in order to maybe be able to break those or readjust them to more healthier eating patterns. So, this really is kind of based on intuitive eating, which is an evidence based mind body health approach that was developed by two dietitians in the early 90s. And kind of what I was mentioning with that research, they really started this research back in the 90s, compiling everything that really showed the damages of dieting. And they saw it within their own work of, giving clients meal plans or focusing on losing weight and how that really wasn't leading to results. Clients weren't losing weight, they weren't sustaining that, they weren't getting healthier, they weren't feeling better. And so they really looked at the research and developed intuitive eating, which is about cultivating that attunement to get your biological and psychological needs met without having to rely on these external diet plans or things like that. And for those of you that like some science, like I do, there are so many proven benefits of intuitive eating. So, intuitive eaters actually tend to have lower BMIs, lower triglyceride levels, disordered eating, emotional eating, higher self esteem, more variety of foods eaten, body appreciation, higher HDL, which is the good cholesterol. Um, Higher resiliency and pleasure from eating. So we get, again, a lot of actual health benefits, both physically and, psychologically from intuitive eating. So kind of the first place to start is with that building that physical attunement. So learning how to honor your hunger. So what is shown on here is a hunger fullness scale. You'll see it goes from 0, which is like, oh my gosh, I'm so hungry. I'm going to pass out, which is not a great feeling, all the way to 10, which is really, really, really uncomfortably full, like Thanksgiving meal full, where you're just like in pain. So again, those are the two extremes, but there's a lot of gray area in the middle. So you might notice that for hunger, there's 4 or 5 different variations of hunger, from ravenous to even just like a slightly empty stomach. And same thing with fullness. We have, comfortably full all the way to really painfully full. So for a lot of individuals, this is a great place to start, because especially if you've been dieting or doing a lot of external things that are telling you how to eat, we tend to really lose touch with what our body's truly hunger and fullness cues are. And it's something I always recommend starting just to tune into your hunger cues. So do you notice you're hungry when your stomach's growling, when you get a headache, low energy or concentration? Hangry is very real. So maybe noticing more irritability, grouchiness, all of that might be cues for you that you are hungry. And I bring this up because there's something known as primal hunger. So how many of you have ever waited until you were super, super hungry to eat? Maybe you were out running errands and you ended up being out longer than you thought. For a lot of us, right, we tend to, something happens, life happens, and maybe we plan to eat, but it got pushed back. So whenever we're in this really ravenous hunger place, what foods do you tend to crave, right? We tend to crave high fat and high carb foods. And this is really a kind of biological mechanism because we're hungry. Our body's like noticing low blood sugar. So it's seeking out high carb foods to raise blood sugar and fat foods because fat has the most calories per gram. So this is why when we're really, really hungry, we can't really make a balanced meal choice because that primal like hormones is really taking over. And that's why we find ourselves in the drive-through or ordering some Uber Eats or throwing the frozen pizza in the oven because we're just so focused on getting that kind of food. And so I say this because I have so many clients where this happens, life happens. And this is really what's driving a lot of unbalanced eating behaviors because it really is a biological mechanism. And so this is where I always encourage people to think about, how hungry do I get during the day? Where do I normally fall? Because if you're getting into that very hungry, ravenous place, you wait until that time to eat, chances are you're going to eat not great foods. And we also tend to overeat and get to where we're more uncomfortably full because our body's just trying to kind of compensate because it thinks that we might not get food again, or it might be hours again. So the other thing to note is stress and anxiety can also really kind of inhibit our hunger cues. And so I know a lot of individuals find that if they're busy working on something or, doing a lot of errands, they might find that they're not really noticing that hunger until they get to that ravenous place. So it's something to note for you as well, does this happen to you? Or, can you pack a snack? Can you set a timer just to help prevent getting to that kind of primal hunger place, especially if it's something that's happening frequently. Obviously, it's going to happen to all of us at points. We're human, but we don't want that to be a habit where we're kind of always just waiting until we're too hungry. So that's kind of the bringing awareness and the physiological cues, but we also have a lot that our thoughts can really influence our eating behaviors. So I always, think this is so helpful when I get asked a lot of nutrition questions, obviously, and for so many people, they kind of don't even realize some food rules that they might have and where they pick that up. It might have been something they read in a magazine when they were like 10, and that's just kind of always been in the back of their mind, something their mom told them, an aunt told them. So it's really interesting when you start to really think about like, oh, do I have certain food rules? Where do they even come from? And how do those really impact my eating? We tend to think that these rules are going to help keep us safe if we tell ourselves to not eat certain foods, but does that really prevent us from eating those foods? I find for most people that it actually backfires. So a lot of times we think about food in this very black or white, all or nothing thinking. And so we tend to, get ourselves into trouble when we eat something that we think we can't have or we break a rule, then that kind of what the hell effect comes in, right? Where we're like, oh, well, I ate that one cookie, so I'm going to just eat all of them. And it's really interesting because I don't see this happen with anything else, but maybe exercise to some degree. But I don't, I've never heard someone tell me like, my rule is to go to bed by 11 p.m. It's 11:05, so screw it. I'm just going to stay up until 3 a.m., right? Like no one says that, but we do the same thing with food and we end up making choices that don't feel good typically for us either when we do that. We also have, and I know get a lot of clients that struggle with a lot of food guilt. So they feel really guilty after eating certain foods. And this is really when there's a lot of categorization. So these foods are good, these foods are bad. And when we label these foods, we end up like attaching morality to that food. So then we as a human feel good or bad based on what we eat. And what happens is this is where that shame and guilt comes when we eat a quote unquote bad food. And so what we can do instead is look at food as very neutral. So rather than foods being good or bad, it's all food. It's all on an even playing field. but we can acknowledge that they definitely have different nutrient composition. So, an apple is going to vary with a slice of apple pie, but there might be a time and a place where that apple pie is what you need. Likewise, there might be a time and a place where that apple is. And this really helps to remove that guilt and shame, which tends to be so much more harmful and damaging, instead of just eating the apple pie and moving on. Then we also have this idea that when we're feeling deprived and we don't have foods available, we tend to have this kind of heightened, emotional kind of desire for these foods. And so we tend to feel like then when we do eat them, we tend to maybe eat them really fast, not even enjoy them. And it really is because of that deprivation and good and bad food mentality. And so a lot of this is really working to give ourselves that permission. So the food no longer feels off limits and feels like it has such an emotional charge. So this is what's known as habituation, which they've done numerous studies with pizza and chocolate and all these really yummy tasting foods. They've given them to participants ad lib, and they said, hey, eat as much as you want for, I think they had college students even for a week doing where they just give them unlimited pizza. And guess what? By day 3, the students were like, I'm over pizza. And so this is the other thing, when we can really give ourselves permission and we know yeah, if I want to eat that chocolate ice cream, I could eat that today and tomorrow, that oftentimes that immediately removes that kind of emotional charge around that food. And so that way, when we do eat it, it's because we actually really want it, not because that kind of emotional charge is holding over us. So that's kind of the physiological, psychological part, but a lot of individuals also might use food as a way to cope with feelings. And so, there's emotional eating, which I think for everyone kind of has a different definition. And I just want to highlight that the reality is, we are all humans, we all have emotions, and we all eat for emotional reasons at times, right? So we might eat because we're sad, happy, excited, lonely, bored, whatever it is. But this really kind of becomes an issue if we're doing this frequently and constantly, or that's kind of our predominant coping mechanism. And so this is where it's helpful sometimes to distinguish when you are eating, is this more out of that emotional hunger versus physical hunger? And physical hunger is what I talked about earlier, the, moodiness, the lack of concentration, lack of energy, it's been a few hours since you've last eaten. That's that physical hunger. So you're like, yep, I'm hungry, I need to eat. Emotional hunger, typically you've probably eaten pretty recently, so it's not really low energy or lack of concentration. And normally individuals feel this kind of in their head, like they're seeking out this certain food. It's a very abrupt and very what's the word, instant kind of desire for a certain food. And so if you are eating emotionally, it can be helpful to kind of stop to take a moment and then check in. So, okay, am I physically hungry or am I more emotionally hungry? Okay, if it's more out of emotion, then you can ask yourself, what am I feeling? Because what happened is that feeling prompted then that desire to go eat as a way to cope. And what can happen for some individuals is over time, that becomes this habit where, again, we're not even consciously aware, but it's like, oh, every time I'm relaxing, I'm then turning to food as a way to relax or to unwind or to reward myself for the day. And so we need to start to bring awareness to why we're eating. And so that's where it can be really helpful to acknowledge, what am I feeling? Okay, I'm feeling stressed. Okay, well, food isn't going to relieve that stress. You might get a little instant of relief, but at the end of the day, once you finish eating, that stress is still going to be there. And typically guilt and shame also will follow. So this is where you can ask yourself, okay, well, what do I need? So rather than maybe seeking out the food, okay, if I'm stressed, maybe I can go call someone, maybe I can go for a walk, maybe I can turn on a funny show. What can I do instead that's going to be an actual healthier coping mechanism than turning to food? And this is also where having a therapist can be helpful if this is something that you're really struggling with, or even just to help come up with other coping strategies. working with a therapist can be really helpful in terms of helping to separate out food and feelings. All right, so you may be on board with all of this, maybe not. But you might also be asking, okay, that sounds great, but how do we bring it back to health, right? So obviously we know that nutrition and what we eat and how we eat really impacts our health. And I always, want to highlight that it's important to look at our overall habits and patterns. So again, I think a lot of the messaging and the media we get is really focused on, this food causes cancer and this food cures cancer. And the reality is we don't eat like a nutrient. We eat food. Food is made up of different nutrients, and we need to look overall at our habits and patterns. So how often are we eating ultra processed foods? How often are we eating more whole, unprocessed fruits, vegetables, legumes, things like that? So taking kind of a larger step back can be really helpful, and can also maybe see areas where you can look to improve upon. Variety. So variety is always so important because just for that reason, every single food has different nutrients. And so the more variety, we get more nutrients. We get more vitamins and minerals, polyphenols, antioxidants, all these great nutrients for our health that are found in different amounts in different plant foods specifically. So that's where variety is really huge, but also just because for our own pleasure and excitement, right? If we're just eating the same thing over and over, we tend to get really sick of that. And that can sometimes lead to seeking out other food because we're just over what we were eating all the time. Also having a loose structure. So as I mentioned, I get a lot of individuals where that primal hunger really kicks in and affects a lot of their eating most of the time. And so I always really encourage trying to have some loose structure. So having, groceries on hand to make meals and snacks, having stuff packed, especially if you're out running errands. Having an idea of meals to make, so you're not having to like take all that time and energy every single meal trying to figure out what to eat, and then you're just like, I'm just going to order this or eat that, when really we can have much more balanced food if we put a little more time and energy into that planning part. And that's also where what we eat at meals really matters too. So if we're only having protein or fat or just some of these macronutrients, we really tend to miss out on feeling the best, getting the most from our food. So it's really important that at meals we tend to have protein, carbohydrate, plant food, and sometimes of like a healthy fat. We also know that all of the health outcomes have shown that the more we up our intake of fruits and vegetables and whole types of foods and have less ultra processed foods, that is definitely conducive to health. So again, kind of looking at our overall pattern, where can we up that fruit and vegetable intake? Where can we up the more whole types and less ultra processed foods? Again, they don't need to be completely avoided because that's what tends to get us into trouble. Like I said, when we tend to say, I'm never going to eat that. But really learning to make peace with food can help. So that way, when you are enjoying a cookie, you're able to enjoy a cookie and let it go and not eat until we feel uncomfortably full or eat and then feel guilty and ashamed, which tends to lead to not other great health behaviors. And then also bringing awareness. So what types of foods and meals leave you feeling the best? We all are very different in terms of how much to eat and when to eat and how often. And so really starting to listen and notice for you, do you feel better when you eat earlier in the evening, or are you someone that needs a snack before bedtime? Everyone is so different. And this is where really listening to your body is going to be the most optimal. So taking it a step further, we talk about health. So many behaviors make up our health. So nutrition absolutely is on there, but we also know that sleep, stress reduction, moving our bodies, having a community, doing activities that we like, our mental health, all of these things impact our overall health. And so we can't only focus on one or two areas and neglect the rest. We really have to be looking at all of these areas. And this is really where making small, sustainable behavior changes really has shown to be the most effective for, promoting health outcomes. And this is also where if we focus on health behaviors instead of weight, we also will see that individuals tend to be healthy regardless of the weight if they're engaging in healthy behaviors. So this is where sometimes that shift can be really helpful rather than trying to manipulate a weight on a scale. If we instead focus on, am I moving my body? Am I getting adequate sleep? Am I eating, fruits and vegetables? Am I decreasing ultra processed foods? Am I staying hydrated? That is going to be much more predictive of better health outcomes. So some things that you can do to get started today is start by even just thinking about your food rules that you might have. When did these come up? How do they serve you now? And start to notice those hunger cues. How hungry do you tend to wait until you eat? How does that affect what you end up eating or how much you're eating? How full do you tend to get? And so this is also a great place where working with a dietitian can be really helpful to try to kind of make that a little more of a comfortable sensation. Starting to think about what way of eating feels good for you. And then this is where incorporating mindfulness, meditation practices are also really helpful to work on building that awareness and attunement. Things like mindful eating, so slowing down, eating without distractions, and kind of tuning into all your senses when you eat, chewing your food, that can have a huge, huge impact on not only your GI function after, because a lot of us tend to eat when we're distracted, we eat really quickly, we don't chew our food, but that again can help us to be much more aware and attuned of like, how does this food feel? How full am I getting? Does this food even taste good anymore? Versus eating more, just much more out of habit and eating whatever is just on our plate. So incorporating these are really great ways to just build that awareness and attunement. And then also working with a dietitian, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes a therapist can also be helpful in certain cases. And then I love this quote of bringing curiosity rather than judgment. So I don't know who said this, but I think this applies so much. Especially, we tend to be so hard on ourselves around food and eating behaviors. And when we can bring curiosity, it has a much different effect. So for example, if you're someone, let's say you came home and you were like, oh my gosh, I came home and I immediately grabbed the chips and I ended up eating that whole bag. So normally we would tend to guilt ourselves, shame ourselves, tell us that we're horrible, and we probably wouldn't feel great, probably wouldn't do other healthy behaviors. And in fact, we might go eat more foods to cope with that feeling of guilt and shame. But instead, we could maybe bring curiosity to that moment and ask ourselves, like, okay, well, you know what? I ended up being out later than I thought, running errands, and I was so hungry that when I came home, I just grabbed the chips, I started eating them. Oh, and then I ended up just eating all of them, and then I felt really not so great afterwards. So maybe what I could do next time is pack snacks when I'm running errands, so that way I can prevent getting home and being so hungry and then eating the chips. Right? So a very different kind of reflection and much more able to kind of not sit in that guilt and shame and instead learn from that and apply that to future situations. And this is where self-compassion is really important too. Because again, I see a lot of clients really hard on themselves, and that tends to just kind of continue a shame spiral instead of letting that go and moving on to like the next day or the next meal. Alrighty, so I know I went through a lot really quickly. As usual, my email is here. So if there are any questions, I believe there were a few coming through. So I'm more than happy to answer any and all questions at this time. Let's see, I think there was at least, I thought I had something earlier. Okay, no questions. Okay. Well, let me know. Feel free to leave any questions.
And we have a small enough group. If anybody would like to just pipe up and say something, you don't have to type it in the chat.
True, sometimes that's a lot easier.
Well, I'll say thank you very much. This is really informative. And I'm wondering if we can get your last slide that had what can we do now? I think that would be helpful for me anyway.
Yes. Let me see if I can pull that one back up. Can you see that okay? Here we go. A little bit better. Awesome.
And then just go ahead and take a screenshot of that slide.
Let me see if I can. Yeah, and I could always send it to you later too as a separate one. But yeah.
So Erin, you did mention private clients. If someone wanted to reach out to you, do you want to talk just a little bit about how that happened?
Yeah, so through the recreation website, which I can add, you can always schedule an appointment for nutrition counseling. There is like a slight fee. It all is just kind of out of pocket. You can pay for it online, schedule online, and then yeah, kind of sitting one-on-one. So whether it's working on intuitive eating or hunger cues, or I have clients that have a medical condition, so nutrition therapy for that specific condition, or just specific nutrition questions. It's really however I can best help you. And there's also a package option as well. So you can either pay kind of individually, or you can always purchase a package option.
And I'm assuming for the time being that's happening via Zoom, right?
Yes, yeah, it will all be over Zoom. So you won't have to drive anywhere, find parking, go to campus, which is great. I love that. So.
And it's private one-on-one. Do you do any small group? I think of sort of the equivalent for alcoholics, the AA. Do you do any sort of eating discussion groups?
That's a great question. So we used to actually on campus before COVID, like once a month, but it's been kind of hard to do virtually. So not at this time, but if that does ever start up again, I will definitely keep you updated.
Okay.
But yeah, for now, it's just the individual counseling.
Terrific. All right. Well, if we don't have any more questions, we will thank you very much and look forward to our next one with you. Thanks so very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.